Poland's main economic advisor in the first 2 years of the transformation and helped Poland make a lot of needed changes and helped cancel Poland's debts and helped stabilize their currency, and was very, very deeply involved in the transformation. And in that period, the person who played the most constructive role in the entire world by far was Mikhail Gorbachev. He enabled the Polish democratization. He enabled the Polish reforms. He helped other countries in the neighborhood to make the democratic transformation. He was a really most remarkable man and basically believed in peace. And he believed in Europe and, of course, talked about the European common home. In 1990, when he initiated the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact, because this started with Gorbachev, dismantling the Warsaw Pact military alliance. Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker said to him, "We will not take advantage of dismantling the Warsaw Pact by moving NATO 1 inch eastward." And this was not only a statement, this was thoroughly discussed and vetted with a tremendous amount of archival material to explain all of the discussions and negotiations about non-NATO enlargement. And to my mind, that's the starting point for understanding what has gone wrong, because we cheated. And the United States was the cheating party, because in 1992, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, who were in the Defense Department of the US, said, "We are now the sole superpower of the world. Now we do what we want." I was briefly Gorbachev's, an advisor to Gorbachev's economic team, and tried to raise Western financial help to stabilize a profoundly unstable, collapsing situation in the Soviet Union, and the White House said no. And then I was asked by President Yeltsin to help him. My main job was get some Western money for us, because the situation is a financial freefall. So I worked with Yegor Gaidar, who was both the finance minister and deputy prime minister in 1992. And the White House said no to every single recommendation that I made. And it was explained to me that even though the recommendations I was making were the same ones that had worked successfully to stabilize Poland, the US would never help Russia in that way. So to my mind, Gorbachev's dream ended with Gorbachev. Yeltsin wanted completely normal relations. He wanted peace. He put his trust first in Bush, then he put his trust in Clinton. Clinton in 1994 sold him a bill of goods. We won't expand NATO, we'll have a partnership agreement, which Yeltsin loved, because the partnership agreement for NATO was that every former Soviet satellite in Central and Eastern Europe would be part of a NATO partnership, but none would be given preference over others. It would really be a new joint relationship. There was a bitter debate inside the Clinton administration between Madeleine Albright, who was a hardliner, Czech hardliner, wanted to stick it to Russia. Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, absolutely hardliner, and Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense, who said, "Do not enlarge NATO. We're just starting to build trust with our Russian counterparts. If you do this, this will be extraordinarily damaging." Albright won the debate. Clinton cheated in my opinion, went ahead with the NATO enlargement. Yeltsin was apoplectic, very, very unhappy, but he was extremely weak, of course, very vulnerable and very weak. Bill Perry, incidentally, thought about resigning in protest, decided not to. Then in his memoirs, written 20 years later, wondered again, should he have resigned? And our greatest statesman scholar of the second half of the 20th century, George Kennan, who was a brilliant man, said, this is a disaster. This is the road to the new Cold War. In 1999, we bombed Belgrade 41 days in a row. We destroyed the infrastructure, we destroyed the electricity, we destroyed the water. That's Bill Clinton, I remind you. No one said war crimes at the time, did they? No. But we said we would break up Serbia to give independence to Kosovo. The Russians were apoplectic again. That's our ally. You're bombing them in the middle of Europe. How many times have you heard per day that this is the first European war since 1945? That's a lie. 1999 war on Serbia. A NATO war, by the way. Not even just a US war, that was NATO bombing of Serbia for 41 consecutive days. Then 9/11 happened. Putin said, we will support you, even support your war in Afghanistan at the beginning. And then Iraq. And Putin was again, are you kidding? You're going to go to war in Iraq? And of course, Russia was completely pushed aside. And that was an ally of Russia, Saddam Hussein. And it was a war on completely phony charges. And by the way, not mistaken charges, phony charges. You could tell it a mile away, by the way. But I remember I was on a talk show. What's his name? Charlie Rose. So, like usual, there were 6 people around the table, all of them saying, war, 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 Saddam, he's Hitler, war, 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 weapons of mass destruction. And it came to me, because this was the day that Colin Powell was in the UN Security Council, and I said, I'm against this war. Mr. Sachs, are you calling General Powell a liar? And the camera was frozen on me, and I said, well, I suppose I am. I don't believe that. It's pretty clear that this is how you talk when you don't really have the goods. Turned out to be that way. 10 years later, everybody knew it at the time. Well, in fact, everybody was in favor of war at the time. It was not pleasant. So that was 2003. Then in 2007, 7 NATO enlargements. And think of them. Bulgaria and Romania and the Black Sea, the 3 Baltic countries, Slovenia and Slovakia. That's a heavy dose for Russia. But then in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, Bush, over the strenuous objections of all European leaders who knew that this was a terrible idea, pushed for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia. And European leaders, being European, they don't speak in public against the United States. So they negotiated. They said, okay, no roadmap, no partnership agreement, but the final declaration will say that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, which is what the 2008 Bucharest summit communique says. The next day was the NATO-Russia summit, because we still had those meetings then. And Putin said to Bush, if you move on NATO enlargement, we will take back Crimea. This was 2008, 14 years ago. Because Crimea is our naval base and has been since 1783, thank you. So in 2010, Yanukovych became president of Ukraine, which was very fortunate for Ukraine, because Yanukovych understood that he was in a delicate balancing act. And so he had Europe and the US on one side, he had Russia on the other side, and the first thing he said is, we need to stay neutral. And so he pushed neutrality through the Ukrainian parliament, and he negotiated a long-term lease arrangement for Sevastopol, that Russia would have its naval base rights until 2041, with the potential of extension after that. Well, Europe pushed very hard for the accession agreement, and the United States pushed very hard to topple Yanukovych. And in the Maidan, though we don't really know all the things that historians someday will know, we do know how active the United States was in stoking the insurrection. And interestingly for me, I was asked by the Ukrainian Prime Minister who came to office the next day, Mr. Yatsenuk, to fly to Kiev to meet with him to talk about the economic situation, which I did. And when I arrived in Kiev, I was shown around by a leading American NGO that described to me all the money that they had put into this successful overthrow. So I saw and heard with my own eyes the American involvement in the overthrow of a pro-Russian government. That's pretty provocative. Europe negotiated the evening in February 2014 that Yanukovych would stay in power and that there would be elections late in 2014. There was gunfight from the Ukrainian nationalist side, because careful scholars have shown that the bullets that killed the policemen and the bullets that killed the protesters were from the same guns from the hotels controlled by the insurrectionists. And Yanukovych fled, and Europe immediately said the next day, okay, we recognize the new government. Because Victoria Nuland, you remember, who loved Europe so much in that taped phone call, I don't know if you remember her French, but I'm sure you do, that was the American policy. So the pro-Russian government was overthrown. A quite radical Russophobic government was brought in extra-constitutionally in violation of the Ukrainian constitution. The US and Europe immediately recognized that government. Putin seized Crimea, and the separatists backed by Russia declared independence of Lugansk and Donetsk.